In today's video, we're going to try something a bit different. So rather than covering concepts that are covered in the subjects of economics, we're going to talk about skills. So one key skill that will be very useful for you in your exam is the skill of answering extended response questions. So why should we practice extended response questions? At the end of the day, extended responses are usually around 40% of your exam mark, so not a small component at all. And if you do well in these questions, then it will help push your grade up. Uh, Secondly, I have a graph on the slide which shows the average mark by assessment type of the current cohort. So we can see that the average of extended response assessment tasks are lower than those that are of short answer format. So what this shows me and what it shows you is that if you improve your ability to answer extended response questions, you have a lot of potential to improve your mark overall. So this is considered an opportunity that I advise you take advantage of. So, and this video will hopefully help you do that. First of all, one of the most important things that you should know is questioning terms. So we've covered this in previous lessons, and I wanted to just put up a summary slide with a table that outlines questioning terms by the level of complexity that is involved in answering questions which start with them. So for example, it starts with low complexity, so questions which begin with identify and describe tend to be quite easy or easier to answer compared to questions which are more complex that begin with terms like evaluate and justify. At the end of the day, you'll have to know what each of these terms mean. And I've, for your benefit, included the most commonly used terms in economics so that you are able to read these and make sure that your understanding is sound. I've also included a link down the bottom of this slide which will show you a whole range of terms which aren't included in this table in case you encounter them in an exam. So definitely learn the meanings or what is expected of you when you see these terms. Another question that is really important is when to use a model. So we have studied a range of models in the Year 12 Economics course, and you will be expected to use this model to demonstrate your answer or your arguments in the exam. So key words in the question that you should look out for, which automatically should trigger this idea that you should use a model, are demonstrate. That's a really obvious indicator or sign that you should use a model. Another very obvious and clear term is literally use so and so model to demonstrate so and so. So when you see that, you will be expected to use a model, and if you do not use a model, then you'll be throwing marks away. So some key models that you've learned are the ADAS model, the AE model, and the demand and supply model. So those three models are probably the key models that you want to know very, very well, although there are a bunch of other models like the PPF model that could also be part of your toolkit. But again, I would suggest you know these three models very, very well. Uh, on the topic of models, I've put down three key requirements that you need to meet to maximize the marks that you gain by using a model. So first of all, use the title, label axes, and label the lines correctly. So you can see in the graph to the right on this slide, we have title, negative AS shock. We have axes labels, so price, and we have real GDP. And at the same time, we also have lines which are labeled correctly. Okay, so these are all super important that you put down and put down correctly. Okay, next, make sure you label old and new equilibriums. So in this case, we can see the old equilibrium is this point. Oops, yep, it's this point, and the new equilibrium is this point. You in this graph, there wasn't an explicit label, but you could do that yourself by saying A or B. And the second point about including appropriate points on the axis. So here I'm referring to the use of yp and P1 for equilibrium point A and Y1 and P2 in equilibrium point B. So these are key terms that you need to mention in your responses in order to maximize the usage of your model and therefore maximize your marks. So that links to the third point where you should refer to specific graph labels in your responses. So in your text, you need to say that, for example, if the economy moves from A to B, the price moves from P1 to P2, while real GDP moves from YP to Y1. The next important point that I wanted to mention is the importance of defining key terms. So you are allocated an explicit amount of marks for defining key terms and concepts, and if you don't define some of these, or if you don't define these terms and concepts, you miss out on easy marks. So make sure that if there are key concepts and terms that you need to refer to or explain, you define them before you start explaining relationships between them. Second point is that if you mention or if you define the term in part A and the question requires you to define the term in part B, you need to actually define the term in the appropriate question that requires the definition. So you won't be able to carry over the definition from part A to part B. So safe thing is to define terms which are important in both questions, as often definitions don't take a lot of time to write down. Thirdly, it's really handy for you to list key terms and relationships between terms during your planning. What this does is it makes your thinking clearer, so you know which terms to include and which relationships are important, and at the same time it ensures that you don't forget to mention the key terms and relationships. So when you're looking through your planning, as you write your extended response, you can tick off terms you've mentioned to make sure that you say everything that you want to say. So I thought I'd go through a really quick example of how I would plan for the question in front of you on the slide. So what I would do is I will shift across to here. Okay, so that is the question which, for example, you might be faced with in the exam. So how would I plan for these responses? So if I look at the first question, explain the methods the Commonwealth Government can use to finance the budget deficit. Straight away, I see that the key question terms explain. So what I would need to do is mention how the government would finance a budget deficit. And we know that there are multiple ways to do that. So straight away, what I would do is I would write down key term, budget deficit. In my mind, I would be thinking, okay, so budget deficit, when does that happen? That happens when government revenue is above expenditure. And this means that this deficit will need to be financed somehow. Next, I would write down something like government needs to borrow, and then think about the ways in which the government can borrow money. So we know that there are three ways. First of all would be to sell CGS to, we'll say, residents. Next would be to sell CGS to non-residents. And finally, we know that the government can also borrow from the RBA. Boom. So that literally would be the planning that I would do for the first question. So it didn't take long at all, but if I were to write through this response, I would be able to make sure that I meet all the requirements of the question and ensure that I don't miss out on anything and that I define the terms that are relevant. So for the next question, demonstrate and explain the short and long-term impact that a budget deficit would have on the level of economic activity. So how would I plan for that? So what I would do is straight away, I would stay on the safe side and I would again define what the budget deficit means. So again, revenue greater than expenditure. You can skip this step if you want. in terms of planning, but make sure you also define budget deficit again. Then for this question, as it's worth a bit more marks, what I would think about is, say, um, expenditure would go up, revenue would go down, right? Now think about what could drive these. So we would think about cyclical and discretionary policies that the government can implement, and this would also apply, to both expenditure and revenue. So thinking or planning this way will sort of start to make you consider a whole bunch of different ideas and therefore inform your answer. So next, we know we need to talk about short term and long term. So then I would say, okay, short term, what's the effect of a budget deficit in the short term? We know that it's expansionary. We know that you've got discretionary policies that can boost things like investment and consumption. If I wanted to talk about the multiplier effect, I'd put down the multiplier as a term. And I'd also say, okay, we know that borrowing from residents can crowd out. So this is a positive. So expansionary would be considered, I guess, a positive impact, and crowding out would be a negative impact. And then I would go to long term. Okay, what would be some long term impacts? I guess you could say that a budget deficit would increase government debt, and then it would also, and that would lead to higher interest payments. You notice that I'm putting down arrows which specifies relationships between key concepts. So those are important to know and also to elaborate on. So if interest payments go up, then consumption would go down and investment would go down, as income that needs to be paid, that income that goes to paying interest payments cannot be used for consumption and investment. Next, I would also think about, I guess, what the government would need to pay back the debt. So we would assume that there would be some form of contractionary policy in the future. So that could be so budget surpluses to pay back debt. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I would do for planning. And we know that we also need to use the ADAS model, so I'd probably quickly do ADAS model. Short term AD would go up, long term AD would go down. That's pretty much it. And then I would put this in front of me while I am writing to ensure that I remember everything that I want to write down. Cool. All right, so that's an example of how I would plan for this question. Moving on, I just wanted to chat a bit about essay and paragraph structure. So at the end of the day, you want to make sure that your response is as easy to read as possible, because the easier it is to read, the easier it is for markers to award marks. Some really common ways to structure paragraphs would be TEAL. So you've probably learned this in English. So start with a topic sentence, followed by an explanation, followed by evidence, and then finally the paragraph is wrapped up with a sentence which links the current paragraph with the next paragraph or concept. You could use other ones like TSSS, so topic sentence, supporting sentence, and so on. Or you could use anything which you're comfortable with. But at the end of the day, a structure in your paragraph makes it easier for the marker to read your paragraph and therefore give you the marks. At the same time, some responses also benefit from an overall structure like an essay. So you might have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Conclusions are really important when it comes to questions that asks you to evaluate ideas or concepts, because the conclusion allows you to pull your arguments together and make a call on whether you think something is beneficial for the economy or not beneficial for the economy. So those are my tips regarding extended responses. In the next video, I'll actually go through a student's response to give you a good example of how you should be writing extended response answers.